Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you guys for being here. I'm really glad I put the word future in the title, because when I'm looking at you and all these young, shiny, happy people, I think I can really see the future of Europe in very bright colors. But hopefully we'll have a good session together, and I'll try to make it as interactive as possible. So if you have any sorts of questions at any point during the presentation, feel free to ask. As Radek mentioned, I've been in Melbourne for over 10 years now, but I'm kind of spending some time here working on a grant that is actually related to the future of the European Union. So hopefully I'll get to share some of my research findings with you as well. So what I want to do, I want to kind of speculate a little bit about kind of four main macroeconomic challenges, or these big macroeconomic question marks that many people fear are facing Europe. So let me introduce them one by one. The question I'm posing is this: is the European Union facing government bankruptcies? Now, we've had a lot of debt crises recently, and as you know, many countries in Europe are not in a very good shape fiscally. So public finances are kind of heading in the wrong direction, it seems. So I want to spend quite a bit of time thinking through the issue of, are we going to see more of that? Is this just the beginning? Are we going to see more kind of sovereign default and potential problems as we've seen in Greece? The second big question mark that I want to look at with you is whether the EU is facing a potential hyperinflation, or very high inflation, prices rising at a very high speed. And you'll see that this is actually fairly linked to the first question, because in the past it's always been the case that, or very often been the case, where people, if the king or the government ran out of money to pay pensions and pay whatever government employees their wages, they would just do the simplest thing that they could do. They would just use the running press, the printing press. They would just abuse the monopoly to print money and create a very high inflation. So we're going to look at the danger of that and the probability that this is going to happen in Europe. A very much related question mark, a big one, is whether we should fear that the common currency in Europe, the euro, is actually going to collapse, or at least break up. So that's certainly something that we're going to look at, and I'm sure many of you already have a view on this. So I'm very much going to draw on your views in these kind of areas. And we're also going to look at the prospect of a very long-term stagnation. The economy underperforming, basically the economic growth, as we've seen, as we've known it for the last 250 years, disappearing. And again, you will hear a lot of people arguing that this is indeed the case. We've already had a pretty long recession over the past few years in many countries, and many people say that this is actually the new normal, that this is going to be the case as we move forward. So I really want to spend some time thinking about this. But before we go into that, I want to know where we're coming from, what you think. So let me just go one by one, and we're going to do a show of hands. And I'm going to give you a bit of a scenario. You need a little bit more information. So suppose, within 10 years' time, or maybe 20, do you think that there's a probability bigger than 50% that one of these will occur? Okay, and I also need to tell you, suppose it's going to be in at least some European country. Okay, so for example, government bankruptcies in, say, 5 European countries, with a probability higher than 50% within the next 10 years. Okay, assuming that the situation, the way that the institutions are set up is not going to change. So first, government bankruptcies. Who thinks there's a high chance, greater than 50% chance, that we're going to see quite a few government bankruptcies in Europe within the next 10 years? Hands up. Okay, so we have maybe 1/3 of people thinking that. Who thinks that the Eurozone is going to experience hyperinflation within about 10 years? Okay, so we've got about maybe 15% of people. What about the collapse of the euro, or a major kind of reformation of the euro, major restructuring of the euro? Hands up, greater than 50% chance. Okay, so we've got about a third again. And what about long-term economic stagnation? No economic growth. Wow. So we've got maybe 90%. That's pretty interesting. Wow. Okay, well, let's just look at each of these issues in greater detail. And if you're interested in more, you can check my website and some of the video interviews that I've recorded with academics and policymakers on the various topics. I also have a column in Hospodářské noviny, which is the Czech financial newspaper, but you need to be able to read Czech to enjoy that. Anyway, let's just look at the interrelations. I post these 4 big question marks to you, and you might have thought, oh, these are kind of just these 4 things that are unrelated. So I'll try to give you a little bit of a structure. I'll try to show you that these things are actually very much interrelated. Okay? And at the end, I'm also going to give you a bit of an analogy, where you'll see this again, but using an analogy of a patient who's sick, who's suffering from diabetes, and then the doctor tells him to do this, and he's doing that, and this is going to have an effect on his health. So if you remember nothing, I'll try you to remember this scheme using the diabetes analogy. But anyway, you might have heard about an aging population problem. What is it, aging population? What does that mean? Does it just mean that we all grow old? Gray hair? What does that mean?
There's a very, like the baby boom after World War II, there's a large number of, there's a large amount of the population that will be, I guess, senior citizens and then no longer earning income within the next, I guess, 15 to 20 years. And there will be more people not earning income than there will be to support that generation. So there'll be a lot of people depending on a smaller amount of
exactly. So this is the arrow going from aging population, and we're going to talk a lot more on that, towards public finances. You mentioned that there's going to be a smaller group of people supporting a greater group of senior citizens who consume a lot of pension and healthcare. But that's just kind of the starting point. So the demographics is going to affect public finances, and obviously here, this is our first question mark. Are public finances in a good shape, or if they're in a bad shape, should we fear, or when should we fear a danger of countries defaulting and going bankrupt? Okay? Now, how does it relate to inflation? As I mentioned, if you look into history, governments have often solved solvency problems by just printing money and creating inflation. So I'll try to convince you, and this is actually a big part of my research, looking at this link between what the government does on the fiscal front, you know, how much they spend and how much taxes they bring out, and how it relates to what the central bank is doing. You know, whether they're setting low interest rates or high interest rates, whether inflation is low or high. So I'm going to kind of model this as a bit of a game between the government on one hand, the fiscal policymaker, and the central bank, the monetary policymaker here. And obviously these things, prices are going to affect other things in the economy. Well, first of all, they're going to affect Eurozone membership. And there are several channels through which it's the case. They're also going to affect economic growth. We know that if inflation is very high, it is very hard to do business because things are just unpredictable, and all you care about is, you know, how you can use the money that you have in your pocket so that it doesn't lose value. Okay, so inflation, high inflation is quite detrimental to economic progress and prosperity of people. And I will also draw a link between the membership in a monetary union, such as the Eurozone, and the economic performance of many countries. And you'll see that if the currency union is not what's called an optimum currency area, then it may have some undesirable consequences on the economic performance of some of the member countries. And I'll try to convince you that that has been the case in the Eurozone. And obviously, these things all link back to the shape of the public finances, because one of the main measures of sustainability of public finances is the debt-to-GDP ratio. You'll see that that's actually a really bad measure, but that's the measure that everyone's using. And as you know, if the economy is going down the drain and GDP is falling, then even if you implement a lot of austerity measures, so in fact you spend less, and your fiscal situation should improve, your debt-to-GDP ratio may actually fall. And the reason is, you've got debt to GDP. If your denominator falls, then the whole thing may actually go up, even if the numerator falls as well. Okay, so this is how all these four big question marks are going to link together. Are there any questions at this stage? So let's go straight into it. And I'll give you a bit of a motivation. This is what I always show my students or my audiences. I will try to interactively involve you in the lecture, and not only because I'm very curious and I want to know what you think, but also because I want you to learn better. And there's a lot of economics or educational research that shows that when people speak, their brain does a very different type of thinking, a different, much deeper type of thinking. So just to show you one piece of experiment that they've run, these two guys published in their book, they basically got people to learn something through different methods. And then after 48 hours, they were looking at how much they actually remembered. And if you just read something, you only remember about 10%. If you hear something, which is generally what you do in a lecture like this, you only remember about 20%. However, if you talk about the topic with other people, you're up to about 70%. And in fact, if you try to teach someone else, you're up to about 95%. So I think it's a really great way to learn, to try to interact in a lecture like this. And in fact, just this is what I always encourage my students. If you go to a lecture where the lecturer doesn't actually involve you, and it's more like a monologue, you need to be proactive, and you need to ask the questions. You need to create a discussion. Just take it in your own hands. Anyway, so let's look at the question number one. Let's look at fiscal sustainability. Let's look at the danger of government bankruptcies. And this is one of the peculiar things that I find about public policy. It's all so short-sighted. It's just, what's going to happen? Is GDP going to be 0.2, next year, or is it going to be minus 0.3? This is so short-sighted, and it should seem even more so to young people like yourselves. We should be thinking decades ahead. We shouldn't care about what's going to happen next year. But, the politicians, because they have these very short political cycles, they kind of, they maneuver us. They just really force us into that mode of thinking, where we spend most of our time thinking about, what's going to happen tomorrow, rather than thinking about what we can do, what kind of reforms we can do in order to improve our prosperity within, 10, 20 years period. But anyway, so all the talk is about the current problems, but the big problems are really looming on the horizon. And few people are talking about them, and no politicians actually want to go there, because they seem to be very unpopular topics to talk about. So let me just plot what's going on. This is the debt-to-GDP ratio. So this is time here. So it's the 80s, it's the 90s, it's here. This is the straight line, this is here. And this is the prediction that's on the horizontal axis. And on the vertical axis, we've got the standard debt-to-GDP statistic. And as you see, countries generally, and I just picked two largest economies in the EU, although no, France is, I think, number 3 now after the UK. But as you see, the debt-to-GDP ratio has been rising, but it's nothing compared to the predictions. In fact, almost under all conceivable circumstances, all the conceivable assumptions you can make about future setting of fiscal policy, you see the debt-to-GDP ratio rising to levels that are clearly unsustainable. Now, if I ask you a question, at what level of debt-to-GDP ratio do you think a country goes bankrupt? Or is there such a level that you can identify? What do you think?
There's not a level, to be honest, because like if you see Japan, they're like 200%, like if you see Italy, it's like 120 or something like that, and there's a difference in like the interest we pay. And I mean, a country goes bust not because it has a huge debt, but because it can't pay the monthly bill, not like so. And that generally happens when interest rates skyrocket, and that happens in Greece. But because, I mean, that depends on confidence and manufacturing, so that's not like that later talks, like if the spread is more than 500 basis points, then the interest rate becomes sort of like 7%, it becomes difficult to handle, but there's not such a breaking point. It's basically when the market loses confidence in you.
Exactly.
They can lend you money if you're fine.
Exactly. This is a very good answer. There are many different factors that determine whether a country gets into a debt crisis or not. So we can't identify an exact. Did you want to add something?
Yeah, I was just wondering because Germany adopted in the constitution that they can't take up debt after 2020. So, I mean, do you think they actually will take up debt however they do that? I mean, does protections sustain that? Or is it actually possible that they don't?
Oh, well, again, now we're moving into politics, and I'd prefer to stick to economics. Politics is more like kind of, trying to fortune tell from a crystal ball to me. But anyway, what I'm trying to say is that there's no clear point, and that was summarized by the first answer. There's no clear-cut point where a country gets into a debt problem. But it's pretty clear that 400% of debt to GDP cannot be sustained by any country. So the general picture is many or most European countries are heading towards even bigger fiscal problems in the future. And I'd like to spend some time thinking about why that is. And I mentioned the demographics, so we're going to talk a lot about the aging population problem. But can you think, other than that, can you see any other reasons why countries have larger and larger deficits? And maybe now we're moving more into the politics. So, yep.
Maybe because of the short-term government, because they are voted only for, let's say, 2 years, so they don't have reason to look ahead.
That's right, but obviously they need to propose policies to us. They appeal to the voters. So the second part of your story would have to be that we are, for some reason, we are also short-sighted, and somehow we fall for this kind of very myopic game. And I agree. This is probably a big part of the problem. People if you look at before the election, it's all about how much you can promise, how much you can promise to spend to these people, and you're basically buying votes. And somehow we kind of got used to this sad reality. But hopefully we'll have time to talk about this. You might have some solutions to this problem. Any other reasons why you think countries are heading more towards bankruptcies or heading? Right, okay, we're going to talk about this. Anything else that you can think of that might be relevant?
Maybe like different kind of shifts in economic ideologies as to what you do, depending on whether you're in profit or surplus or whether you're in deficit, and whether you try and spend your way out of it or whether you save during times that are good. And that kind of changed a bit to people just kind of spending all the time, and no one's really been saving for a while.
Yeah, very good. That's right. So you're kind of thinking more moving towards the Keynesian ideology, where the mantra is spending more. Okay, I think these are both very good reasons. Any other possible? It's interesting, right? It's in economics. This is called discounting. You know, the way your kind of measure of impatience, how much you prefer the present as opposed to the future, is reflected in the interest rate that you use to discount the future. Okay, so suppose you had the choice of getting $1,000 today as opposed to $1,000 tomorrow, or say next year. I mean, virtually everyone would choose $1,000 today. And now let's increase the amount. You know, would you still choose $1,000 today, or say $1,100 next year? Most people would still choose. A lot of people would still choose $1,000 today, right? And now keep increasing the amount. You'll see that the level with which we discount future is quite staggering, and it's been increasing over time. It seems like our ancestors were a lot more patient, and this is really interesting also because life expectancy is much greater. So if anything, we should be more forward-looking. We should be more kind of thinking about the future. But maybe it's the technology, it's the lifestyle. Maybe it's because, you know, everything just changes so rapidly. Interesting. I don't have answers to that. But let's look at the justification that I want to talk about, and that's aging. So this is one part of it. The reason that populations, the median age in the population is increasing, is basically composed of two different separate trends. One of them is the fact that people live longer. Okay, life expectancy has been increasing quite steadily, and the other reason is that people have fewer kids. Okay, and you can see that across countries virtually everywhere in the world. If you combine these two trends, what you see is that the proportion of the elderly in the population is predicted to increase quite substantially. One way to measure it is what's called the old age dependency ratio. So that's the variable on the vertical axis. And it's basically a percentage of people in the 65 years old or older relative to everyone else except kids, 1 to 14. Okay? And as you see, in most countries, in fact, virtually all high-income countries, you see an increasing trend, which is about to pick up quite substantially. By the way, if you look at Japan, which is the top country here, what you see is that the aging population trend started basically 2 decades before everyone else. And often when we talk about Japan, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about Japan in relation to deflation, people talk about these 2 lost decades. Basically, they've been growing after the Second World War. They were in the 60s, they were growing like 10% every year. And then that was kind of dropping 8, and every subsequent decade, the growth has slowed down, and basically in 1990, it disappeared. And they've had a stagnation ever since. It's a little bit misleading, and very few people talk about the banking problems and, you know, all various sorts of reasons. Few people actually point to this. They point to the fact that the aging population problem just kicked in earlier than it's going to do in the rest of the countries. But one reason why it's misleading is when you have these large demographic shifts, you cannot look at the GDP of the country as a whole. You need to look at GDP per capita, or even GDP per worker. And what you see in terms of Japan, yes, the 90s was a lost decade, but ever since, the growth per capita wasn't actually so bad. It was pretty much the same as in the US or in the core of Europe. So this is one thing that people don't realize about Japan. But going back to what's coming, as you see, some countries, and it's not just high-income countries, you see that China, for example, is going to see a pretty big increase in the old age dependency ratio. And you know, you're obviously aware of the one-child policy, so they've had some dramatic measures to reduce fertility, which they managed to, but obviously now things are going to be interesting. The black line, the thick black line, is the average for all advanced countries, and as you see, there's an increasing trend. But even if you bunch up China, India, and what's called developing countries, although I really dislike this, this label, we're going to have the same trend. So it's a worldwide trend. And let's look at the implication. This is actually from a slightly different point of view. This is what's called the total dependency ratio on the vertical axis. And here we actually also throw in the kids, okay, because they are dependent. So the elderly are dependent, the kids are dependent, and these are over the working age population. And what you see is that here in the early 2000s, we had the most favorable situation. So here, the proportion of working people relative to the elderly and the kids, the dependent population, was the highest, okay? And we, I mean most Western countries, still managed to run deficits, okay? So that was the most favorable situation from the fiscal point of view, from the fiscal sustainability point of view. As you can see, from pretty much now, the situation is going to get dramatically worse. Okay, any questions so far about these dependency ratios? So, yep. This is okay. So here in the numerator we have the 65 and over plus people aged or kids aged 0 to 14. Okay, whereas there we had just the elderly. No, it's not so much that. It's just that in some countries, you had a backlog of kind of kids that were coming through, and now that's going to, and they're going to. So that's why this trend. If you look at the black line, this decrease was due to the fact that we actually had quite a few. There were not that many kids already, and we had quite a few of those working age people. Okay.
Quick question. So we say advancing countries and developing countries. How do you define them? Like, would Brazil and South Africa be?
Yeah.
Kind of advanced, or are they still developing?
No, they'd be classified as developing here. Okay. Yeah. So the question was about the classification of the countries in terms of where do we classify countries like Brazil and so on. And here they'd be classified as developing. Although has anyone heard of the Gapminder? Hans Rosling. Write it down and Google it. It's a fascinating. This Hans Rosling is a fascinating Swedish academic, and he developed this software called the Gapminder, and it's an online application which allows you to plot the relationships between various pieces of data for various countries. So you can see how fertility or mortality or income per capita, how these things were changing over time for different countries. And he has been a very active proponent of this idea that the distinction between developed and developing countries is no longer applicable. It's pretty much a myth. What we now have as what we used to call developing countries are now in many respects at the very levels that the developed countries were just a couple of decades ago. So anyway, I encourage you to look it up because it's quite eye-opening. We tend to have these prejudices and these kind of clear distinctions, developing, but it's sometimes we talk about reality that was maybe 20, 30 years ago, but doesn't reflect the current situation. But anyway, if you thought that was bad enough, the situation is actually worse. Because if you look at, so the green bar here is the old age dependency ratio that we saw on the first slide. And the blue one is what actually matters for fiscal policy, for fiscal sustainability, and that's the pensioner per worker ratio. And what you see is that in many countries, the pensioner per worker ratio is much, much higher than what the old age dependency ratio suggests. Well, partly it's because many people below 65 are no longer working. And recall the old age dependency ratio had the cutoff at 65. Many people above 15 or even above 20 are still not working. So anyway, this is the situation is worse than what you see when you just look at old age dependency ratios. Now, in terms of the implication for public finances, it's not so difficult to understand. So here, the horizontal axis is the age. It's the age profile, so starting at 0, finishing at 100 years old. This is data for the United States, and these are expenditures on pensions and healthcare. So I'm not going to talk about the details of these units on the vertical axis. Don't worry about that. I just want you to look at the profile. So Social Security is the pension system, and obviously pensions are received by people after the age of 60 or 65. So you see that there's a dramatic increase in government expenditures on pensions. But the bigger thing, and again, many people don't realize that it's not just pensions. The bigger problem is healthcare. Because when you have a lot of old people, you see that most of the healthcare costs, and that's Medicaid, Medicare, again, let's not worry about the details of what it is in the United States, but again, these things rise dramatically when people reach the age of about 65 and so on. There's various statistics, but sometimes, you know, a big chunk of all healthcare costs are spent in the last year of a person's life. Okay, so if you have a lot of people in this older age category, you're going to have a dramatic increase in healthcare costs. Okay, what about the revenue side? Because obviously government budget is about the revenue and is about the expenditures. Well, again, the revenues are mainly coming from income taxes that are paid by people between 20 and 70, as well as what's called payroll taxes in the United States. The other taxes are fairly small. So again, you have a situation where you know that the revenues are going to be falling with the shrinking working age population, but the expenditures are going to be ballooning. And if you thought it was just the United States, or it was just Germany, or it was just France, then let's think again. This IMF research paper is looking at is trying to calculate the net present value of the impact of the aging population on budget deficits. And it relates it to the cost of the global financial crisis. And as you see here, so that's the second column, and it's reported as the proportion to as a percentage of GDP. And as you see in the second column, aging is a lot more important than the crisis for virtually all countries, maybe except Ireland. Okay, that had a huge cost in terms of stabilizing its banking system. So the cost of aging is multiples of GDP, 400, 500% of GDP. And again, so this corresponds to the graphs that we had, the debt-to-GDP ratio in Germany and France rising. Okay, so again, if someone tries to tell you that the debt crises we've seen are pretty much just mainly because of the global financial crisis, so it's everything is America's fault, then obviously pay no attention, because you know that the underlying problem is somewhere else. Okay, so let's move. How did we get into this mess? Why is it that the pension and health systems are going in the wrong direction? And now we're moving again into the politics, and it's actually a really interesting kind of a case study in politics. Well, I would argue that it pretty much works as a marketing pyramid. The multi-level marketing, someone knocks on your door or someone tries to sign you up. I'm sure you've heard of those stories. Bernard Madoff basically almost bankrupt Wall Street and many people, and that was working as a marketing pyramid. So you've got someone at the top, and you sign up people, and these people give some money, and as long as you can, and you don't have to do anything with the money, as long as you keep signing up more people, then the inflow of fresh money is going to be able to satisfy everyone who's at the top of the pyramid. Okay, so everyone up here is happy. Obviously, who's not happy are the people at the very bottom of the pyramid, because when the show is over, these are the people who are not going to get paid and who are going to lose their money. You can think of the pension system in high-income countries as working exactly this way. Well, why? Because think about the 1960s and 1970s. You know, big population growth. So the people, people were working, they were contributing, they were saving up for their pension through the public pension system. Okay? So the pyramid was growing. And the amount of money that was coming in the system was also growing. But that's the, so where's the issue? Well, the issue is, if you took that money, and you saved it up for the time that these people are going to retire, then there would be no problem, even if you have changes in the demographic profile of the population. But the problem is that because that pension money was generally subsumed in the budget, this is what's called pay-as-you-go system. Okay, you take the money as you have it, and you just pay for your all other expenditures that you had. So all the money that was collected for pensions as well as other things were just spent in that 1 year, in that particular year. Okay? And now what happens is that the pyramid, the demographic profile has changed, but the money is no longer there. These older generations got more money, for political reasons that we discussed, got more money than they contributed to the system. Okay? And now the money is not there. I mean, whenever I talk to people who are the generation of my parents, kind of early, just freshly retired, they always tell you, oh, we've saved up, we were contributing, we were paying the pension contributions all our life, we deserve this. Yeah, the problem is that because the system is so opaque, it's not transparent, you can't actually calculate how much, or you can, but most people don't know how much they put in the system and how much they got. And the numbers are clear. Most people kind of in their 60s and maybe 70s, they got out of the system a lot more than they put in. Okay? And if you do what's called a generational accounting, which is look at the various different cohorts, the people who are 20 years old now, who are 25, who are 30, and so on, and you look at how much taxes they will have to pay into the system, you'll see that the tax burden will be maybe, these are numbers for the US, they'll be pretty much double of what the tax burden of someone who's like 60 years old now in the US. Okay? So, again, this is, there's not that much we can do about this now because the money is clearly not there. Okay? But what I'm suggesting, and I'm spending a fair amount of effort through my kind of writing, that we should really try to reform the system in a way that's generationally fair. So again, we should calculate, okay, this is how much money is missing in the system, and now let's design a system that will deal with the aging population problem in a way that will cut each generation kind of roughly the same way. Because unless we do that, if we keep rolled in the current system and we keep giving whatever we promise to the existing pensioners, then what's going to happen is that they get everything, and then eventually there'll be a big drop. Okay, and that's not fair. It would be much superior from not just on the fairness perspective, but also from an economic point of view, if we reform it in a way that's actually fair to all these different generations. Because, why do I say economically? Because if some young generation, future generation will get hit with double the amount of tax, then obviously they're not going to be happy. There are going to be huge disincentives for them to work, and that's going to lead to an economic decline and so on. So it's not just the fairness; it's also the efficiency of the economic system. So anyway, the marketing pyramid is still here, and politicians. There are some politicians brave enough to try to tackle the problem, but unless people put pressure on them to come up with a very long-term solution, they're not going to be successful in implementing reforms. There are only a handful of countries that were able to reform their pension system, Australia being a prime example, New Zealand, Scandinavian countries, most of them have done a very good pension reform. But in terms of the rest of the Europe, there's nothing happening. Italy had some reform. They don't even know how they did that, but there was some, I don't know how many years ago, quite a few years ago. So when you look at their number here, they actually are coming out, they're coming out as better than most other countries. But everyone's in trouble, okay? Everyone needs pretty big reforms. And if you want to know more about fiscal sustainability, I have a video, a 1-hour video interview on YouTube on these issues. Are there any questions regarding?
Well, yeah, I was just wondering because it said like no other country has done really something. I mean, I'm from Germany, so I'm asking about that again. There was something. Would you say that was basically just throw out the water?
Yeah, it wasn't enough. In fact, Germany is an interesting case. I was when I was giving a talk there last time, I was talking to the people, and in the 90s, where a lot of these things were discussed, there was one of the key arguments against a system of capital accumulation, where you have what's called the second pillar, usually according to the World Bank. So people contribute through, they have like an individual pension account, and you have private pension funds. And so on, and whatever is saved can get invested. And basically, the German colleagues, they said, there was this theory, and it's called asset. If you want to look it up, it's called asset meltdown hypothesis. That said that even this system is not immune to these demographic changes. And the idea is, okay, well, maybe the public budget is going to be saved, but imagine if you have a big drop in the number of working age people, it's going to have a big effect on the asset markets. So the stock market, as soon as all the elderly are going to retire, the stock market is going to be affected negatively, and the returns are going to shrink. Okay, so even though they will not. There's no danger that they will lose the pension that they were promised by the government, because now it's in the second pillar provided by the private sector. The returns are going to be much lower than they expected. That's the theory, okay? That's a hypothesis. And it's not clear-cut, but the research that I've seen on this shows that, yes, there may be something like that happening, but it's quantitatively, it's very, very small. Okay, it may be just a few tenths of a percentage point decrease in terms of the returns. Okay, so it seems like it's not something that we should worry too much, but we need more research on that. Okay, I'm giving you some links here. Larry Kotlikov's been arguing for a long time that the debt-to-GDP ratio is a very obsolete, in fact, wrong statistic. Why? Because it's a branding issue. Okay, the debt to GDP ratio. If a country borrows money from a different country, then it shows up in the debt to GDP statistic. Okay, but the pension contributions that working people, have paid all their lives are not in the debt to GDP ratio. But I would argue that it's a pretty big liability, okay? In fact, it's more likely that the government is going to pay its own pensioners and not to the other country that it's borrowed from. So the pension contributions that the government collected are very much a liability, very much a debt of the government towards its future pensioners. And it doesn't show up in the official debt to GDP statistic. Therefore, a much more accurate and all-encompassing statistic is what's called the fiscal gap. The fiscal gap is basically just calculating the net present value of all the expenditures that the government is going to have based on the existing or the likely legislation at the time and demographic trends and all those kind of assumptions, minus all the net present value of all the future revenues that the government is going to have. Okay? And when you look at the estimates for various countries, this fiscal gap is multiples of the debt to GDP ratio. In the US, for example, the official debt is about 16 trillion US dollars. The fiscal gap is about 230 trillion, more than 20 times more. Okay? So this is the figure we should be looking at, because it has all of the liabilities of the government. It just doesn't select some, but ignores some others.
That's true, that's like mentioned many times. But I think sometimes a bit biased just to mention big part, because it's true that GDP is not a good measurement, but there are also other big things that are other actually assets that are not taken into account. Like if the government spends money to build a school, then if it was a private company, they would consider it in the asset part of their balance sheet, while in the state that became a liability, and that's only liability, well there's no asset to that. And obviously it's not taken into account, because obviously like you build a road, and how are you going to depreciate a road or amortize a road? That's very difficult.
So you're saying that the GDP, because it only has the school, the cost of the school in 1 year and not in the others, it underestimates.
Purchase a service rather than an asset is not considered an investment. I mean, all the assets part of the state is generally not taken into account when you take the debt. So that brings it down. And also there's another thing like inflation. Generally, these are not figures adjusted for inflation.
No. This is, real GDP. We always talk about real GDP, but
It's difficult to predict what inflation will be in the future.
right. Yeah, but okay. No, I take your point. I mean, there's various sorts of issues with GDP. In fact, we're going to talk about some of them in a bit. Yeah.
That's what I was saying. There's not, I mean, it's just probably the whole picture is worse than what we think, but not as worse as like times worse is a bit.
Well, the future will show. So, what about the sustainability? Now, as I mentioned, and you might have some ideas that I'd like to hear. As I mentioned, healthcare is a big threat, and no one seems to have a good answer. In terms of the pension systems, we kind of know how it can be done. In fact, some countries have done it. The Australian system has worked fairly well for the last, more than 20 years. So we know kind of where we should be going. But in terms of healthcare, we don't know. It's such an interesting kind of industry, or such an interesting area. If you look at one thing we do know is that going all private, there's a large group of people who believe that, all government is wrong and the private sector does everything better, which in fact I was, I think, if you take the two extremes of, all government, all private, most people like myself who come from a post-communist country would kind of tend to be, because they've seen how bad things can be under the government rule, they tend to be more towards the private sector. But in healthcare, it doesn't seem to be the case. If you look at the US, for example, they've got by far the highest amount of money as a proportion of GDP spent on healthcare. I think it's something like in the order of 16% of GDP. And in countries like Finland and many others, it's 6, 7, 8, 9%. And the health outcomes in such countries are much better than in the US. So because of all those various peculiarities of the healthcare system, one of them being that you can't really judge, the effect on your health very well. There's a lot of kind of asymmetric information. Going all private in here doesn't seem to be the solution. But again, if you look at the healthcare costs, they've been going through the roof in terms of the public spending. And it's not just because we have more elderlies. Even if you look at per capita, even if you age adjusted, because of the new technologies, we have better treatments and so on. Per capita healthcare costs have been rising in an unsustainable way. So we need a system where the incentives are such that people actually care about their health, you know, and so on. And doctors just don't go out and prescribe all these, you know, very expensive medicines without trying other things, you know. But again, it's very hard. People don't like to hear that they should be responsible for their own health. We just go to the doctor and demand some solution.
I think if you're talking about the U.S., I think there's a larger issue because, like, if you go back and look at those charts and you look at, you know, where Medicaid and Medicare are spending, it's all 65 plus. So, like, the working class is, like, when I say working class, I mean, like, the people who are working, not by income. So people who are working are paying their income taxes to support the healthcare of those elderly. And then they also have to go and buy their own private health insurance as well as for their families. So I don't know if it's as much of an issue that they don't care about healthcare. I think it's more of they can't afford it because they're covering other people's health insurance in the public fund, and then they have to go buy their own private, which is even more expensive.
Look, I agree. I acknowledge that an average person in the U.S. pays a much greater share on healthcare than in other countries. What I'm saying is that somehow the money, you know, the outcomes in terms of the quality of the healthcare and, you know, health of the citizens actually don't reflect this amount of spending in the U.S. So something kind of is not working there. Okay. Now, when you talk about fiscal sustainability and Europe, and now we're kind of getting into the nitty-gritty of things, many people just go, okay, well, the situation is terrible, we need to start saving, okay? And again, because of these short horizons, the governments have really embraced this austerity train. So they said, okay, well, we need to just cut spending, we need to raise taxes, we need to balance the budgets, you know, within a year. Let's do all that. Has this been a good solution for Europe? Has this been a good solution for Europe? No? Okay, let me now do what I call a bus time. And we're going to do quite a few of these today. So I would like you to discuss what you think, and does everyone know what austerity measures are? So again, all these cuts to various things and increasing taxes. Do you think that they're a good recipe for Europe now? And okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to give you 2 minutes to discuss with the person sitting next to you, or maybe even you can turn around and discuss with the 4 people. And you're going to have 2 minutes. Try to come up with some answers. Austerity measures, good, bad, because this or that. Okay, what kind of effect it has on the economy? What kind of effect it has on debt, and so on. Okay, so 2 minutes. Go for it. Austerity measures and Europe, relating the budget cuts and the economic performance. What do you think, guys? Someone else now? Any views here? Anybody? Shh, guys, please. Yep.
By putting higher interest rates on like saving accounts and things like ISAs, you can encourage austerity by having people saving money for the future rather than spending it today.
Right. That's right. Higher. Let me just reproduce. So obviously the effect. Interest rates have an effect on how much people save. So, and from a longer-term perspective, I'll talk about economic growth in a moment. From a long-term perspective, we should certainly save more. But in terms of the short term, if you're in an economic downturn, saving is actually counterproductive in some ways. Why? I mean, if people decide, if all of us decide to save at the same time, then the firms go like, oops, I mean, we're not selling any of our products. We need to fire some of our workers. And again, the workers' unemployment goes up and economic performance goes down. And it's like a vicious circle. If you're interested in more, this is actually what's called the paradox of the thrift. Often attributed, I think, to Keynes, but maybe I think it was older than him. But the idea is that, you know, what might be good for you in the sense that you want to save more may actually be counterproductive if everyone engages in the same sort of activity, paradox of the thrift. But anyway, going back to austerity and Europe, any other views here? There were some more hands. I want to give an opportunity to. Yep.
I have nothing to say about what you just said. What you said makes a lot of sense and is, I suppose, correct, but isn't part of the problem from the things you're highlighting that we don't say quite enough that our mentality is of just spending as we go, but then we don't, and I think the austerity, the time we're doing it now, isn't really, it's for exactly the reason why it's not really effective, and it's not really, I don't think it's just really killing the patients, but when we teach people to save, when we instill the mentality of saving, if now's not a good time, but then when we're in growth, that's not a good time either because there's an interest. When does
this is a good point, but I would give you an analogy. I mean, imagine you're a bit overweight, but you're at the same time you're suffering from some sickness. Okay, so you know you should kind of limit the amount of food that you're taking, but at the same time, when you're sick, you need the nutrients and so on. So it may be a really bad idea to start, starving. Yeah. So this is kind of the same thing here. Yes, in the longer term, we need to save more and spend less in order to sustain technological progress and investment and so on. We'll talk about that in a moment. But it may not be, the timing is really important. You don't want to do it in a recession. The other thing is about how you do that. I just try to convince you that the big issues are really, in the future. They're going to kick in soon, the pension systems and so on. What the governments have done, and these austerity measures you've seen in Europe, have not been dealing with these things. Basically, what they've done is that they try to balance the budget in any way they could. Arbitrary cuts to, spending on education, spending on investment, and so on. All these long-term drivers that we need, they were cut. Arbitrary increases in, the value-added tax. Everything was just arbitrary. Everything was just, okay, well, we need this many billion of euros. Well, let's just cut here and there. Why is this detrimental to the economy? Well, because it increases uncertainty. People just don't know, they can't plan ahead because there's all these changes going around. And, when you take into account this increases in the age of the population, what will happen is that next year, you will have to do more arbitrary cuts because you're going to have more elderly, you're going to have fewer working age people. So you go like, oops, we've just done all the cuts and we're still missing some money. And let's do more cuts. This is, so we need to have a long-term view and kind of conceptual reforms that deal with the underlying problem. We can't just have these cuts. Obviously, now, I'm not talking about countries who are already in a debt crisis. Greece and so on, they just have to do cuts. Now, unfortunately. Okay? And this is, by the way, this is the reason why you never want to get to that situation. Okay? You want to start dealing with the problems early enough so that you're not under this severe pressure of having to do these very costly things. Okay? And I'll show you a picture of showing the correlation between how much austerity a country have done in Europe and its economic performance. And there's a very clear negative correlation. Okay? The biggest austerity countries are the ones that are suffering most economically. Okay, but we'll talk about it in a moment. Let's go back to, and I like the way you talked. I think it's the time of the presentation where you need to refresh a little bit. So we're going to do another bus time. Now this figure shows you the total fertility in the Czech Republic since 1950. So here, roughly speaking, this is the number of children per per woman, and this is the time. So vertical x is number of children per woman, horizontal x is the time. And as you see, there's been a pretty clear downward trend from some level of, say, 2.8 to a level to a trough of 1.2 children per woman, and then it's picked up a little bit, but it's dropping again. So if you were an econometrician, who looks at numbers and who looks at trends. And also, you're someone who understands these underlying trends behind fertility. Why I'm sure you have some explanation for why people have fewer kids. So if I ask you, what do you think would be the total fertility in the Czech Republic in about 30 years, say 2040? Okay? And I'm going to give you just maybe 1 minute to discuss with the person sitting next to you. You can talk about why you think there's this downward trend. You can also maybe talk about why there was a bit of a pickup, and most importantly, what you think this fertility will be in about 2040. Okay? So go for it. Just 1 minute. Okay, throw some numbers at me. 1.2 or 2.1, okay? 1.2. 2.0. You try to convince them to have more kids. Hopefully right now. No. You see, this was one of my lame jokes. I always have that in my classes. In Australia, at the end of the semester, you have this teaching evaluation, and the students answer a set of questions about how they like the subject, how they like the lecturer. And once one of the students wrote, Jan he's nice, but sometimes he doesn't realize that students are laughing at him rather than with him. That's fine. I don't mind. So I keep throwing these jokes, and often no one laughs. But so other numbers, other predictions.
We thought about 2, like 1.7 to 2.
Okay, all right. Okay, so someone kind of thinks closer to 1, maybe. Okay, so say who's above 1.5 and below 1.5. So above 1.5, hands up. Okay, and below 1.5. Okay, that's like 80% thinks it's below 1.5. All right. Now I have to agree, and to be able to convince even the rest of you, the 20%, let me give you a bit of an international perspective. Okay. So let's not talk about what we think is behind this trend. Although let's address it. Why do you think there's this decrease virtually everywhere in the world? Any ideas?
Because of like female education, women are having children later in life. They're concentrating more on their career, and so to have later in life, they tend to have less children.
Exactly. So they have it. They have it later in life. They concentrate on their career, education.
Also, educating and raising children is getting more and more expensive.
Exactly. So education is more expensive. So you focus on the quantity rather than the quality rather than the quantity. Okay.
And also there is decreasing the sense of having more children mean that I'm more secured on my pension and so on.
Okay, that's right. So maybe the links between the parents and the children are not as tight anymore. So, or maybe they are tighter. I'm not sure. But any other reasons this trend?
I heard when I was in Estonia that people were saying they didn't have much else to do.
And now they can watch Fox News. I mean, what's not to like?
More and more understanding that there's so much out there to do, as well as for women as for men, that they just started with, or not at all.
That's right, yeah. Partly it might also be the lifestyle. Maybe we kind of, on some levels, we're more healthy than the generation of our, parents and grandparents. But on another level, if you sit 15 hours a day, if you sit behind the computer, I think it, at least for guys, it might decrease their chances of. By the way, this is just interesting here, and I'm not looking at you. This is interesting. Hands up who would like to have at least 3 kids here. Okay, all right. Okay, so that we're talking maybe maybe 5 out of 30, which is not a very high proportion. Who would like to have less than 2 kids? Fewer than 2 kids. Okay. So say. No, I didn't want it to sound too pessimistic, you know. Yes, okay, 1 or less. Okay, so we had about 7 people. And you know, guys, imagine this is before the reality kicks in. So once you start having kids, and it's great, you know, but most people kind of downgrade the number of kids that they want to have. So, okay, so let's look at the international perspective. World as a total had 5, the total fertility of 5 after the Second World War. Now, and we're talking both high income and low income countries combined, only have 2.5. Even countries that you normally think of as, these really highly populated countries, like Bangladesh, which was between 6-7 kids relatively recently, are now to about 2.5. Okay? Even countries like Bahrain, Costa Rica, Chile are already below 2. And in fact, the majority of countries in the EU are already below 1.5. Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, close to 1. Now, people might say, oh, this is, they're basically cities. But the thing is, virtually all countries see a big migration from, rural areas to urban areas. So most countries are going to look more like Singapore in the future than they do now. And now, yeah?
Yeah, I was wondering how much to take into consideration that in early times, like children died before they could even work.
Look, it's all adjusted here. So this is this fairly encompassing figure. I know I agree that could change things a little bit, but you can think of this as this is what gives you the implication for the of old age dependency ratios and so on. Now, if you look at and this is the key thing. This is why I talk about this. When you look at fiscal projections and sustainability projections for the future, most countries, the estimate for the Czech Republic, the assumption for the Czech Republic on the fertility ratio in about 250 is the value 1.6, 1.7. Okay, so going back to the graph here, basically what you would have to see is a fairly significant increase in the fertility ratio. To be honest, I'm not aware of a single case in the world where a country would have gone from, say, a trough of 1.1 or even, say, 1.3 back to 1.7. The relationship between fertility and prosperity, so, income per capita, is one of the most robust relationships. People get richer, they get fewer kids, okay? So what I'm trying to say is that the official, many of the official fiscal kind of projections are overly optimistic because they, or at least to me, and I'm not a demographer, okay? So I'm kind of out of my territory here. But based on this international perspective and everything I've read, this seems to me, I'd be happy to buy everyone here a beer if the Czech Republic ever goes back to a 1.65. But I would bet my last dollar that this is not going to happen. Okay? So the official kind of projections tend to be overly optimistic because they have underlying fertility assumptions that I think are too optimistic. So whenever you hear these predictions and people claiming, pension systems and public finances are sustainable, always ask them about their assumptions on fertility. And usually you'll find that they're quite surprising. Okay? Yep.
I have one question. How long are we actually measuring this fertility rate? Because maybe from the statistical perspective, we have just too short sample to do any relevant results for next 100 and 200 years.
Look, we've got, if you look at one country, I mean, you have some 65 observations, but clearly, if you look across countries, this is what's going to give you a lot more statistical kind of relevance. And again, you see this. In fact, in other countries, you don't see these kinks, because we've had, like here, there were some peculiar attempts by the communists to boost fertility. You know, I'm not saying that they went door to door and checked whether you were having sex, but anyway, they were, you know, there were incentives in place, and even then, it had a very short-lived effect. Okay, and it start falling again. Okay, the second. This seems to be like postponing. A lot of women here kind of postpone having children. So there was a big kind of like a structural break. Here, women had children in their early 20s, and here you move as this generation that moved to early 30s. So, but again, this increase seems to be falling. So now the prediction for next year is already like 1.37 or 1.39. Okay, so. What I'd like to do now, let's do a short break. We're almost halfway through, and we've done question 1 only. We've got 3 more remaining, but they all kind of relate to the first one. So somehow the first one was the key. So we're going to look at the danger of hyperinflation, of long-term stagnation, of collapse of the euro. Okay, so let me just briefly summarize what we've done so far. We talked about one big question mark. About the sustainability of public finances. We talked about the demographic trends. We talked about the dangers that are coming. We talked about the effect of the fertility. We talked about the effect of increasing life expectancy. Now we're going to move on to the 3 remaining question marks: hyperinflation, collapse of the euro, and long-term stagnation. And I'll try to convince you that they all somehow relate to the first one, which is public finances. So let me, when we talk about hyperinflation, you obviously start with central banks. And many people argue that central banks have been printing money recently, you know, due to the global financial crisis, in order to save banks, in order to save countries. So let's look at the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve in the United States. And it's pretty instructive. Up until the crisis in 2007, 2008, here it kind of started in 2007, but really started in 2008 in September, following the collapse of the Lehman Brothers. So before that, the balance sheet of a central bank is really boring. You know, basically, all it has is these short-term government bonds. By the way, any ideas why central banks hold government bonds? What they do with them? They use them for open market operations, which is, you know, buying, selling government bonds from financial institutions in order to change the amount of money in the economy, and hence change the interest rate. And through the interest rate, they're trying to somehow affect the economic performance. Now, I know some of you may have only very limited knowledge from economics, so let me give you a bit of an analogy how it works. Think about it as you know, the economy goes through these cycles, okay? Sometimes the economy is doing better, we call it some kind of expansion or a peak, and then it goes kind of into a downturn. So how does the central bank, through monetary policy, how does it use interest rates and the amount of money in the economy to affect economic performance? Well, simply speaking, whenever the economy is kind of overheating and there are inflationary pressures, central bank has to kind of step on the brake. Okay, so it raises interest rates, lowers the amount of money in the economy, and because money is more expensive, people save more and spend less, and companies invest less, okay? And GDP falls, consumption falls, investment falls. On the other hand, when the economy is not doing too well, the central bank steps on the accelerator by lowering the interest rates, increasing the amount of money in the economy, making it cheaper, in which case people spend more and firms invest more. They borrow cheaply and invest more. Okay, so this is how it works. In order to be able to do that, they use these short-term government bonds. Now, what you see is that obviously this brown area was basically lending, emergency lending to financial institutions. That's mainly gone. But what happened? Well, as part of the Operation Twist and other operations, the Fed now holds a lot of long-term government bonds, okay, which wasn't the case in the past. And this new big chunk here is basically holding of these of these mortgage-backed securities. Many of them kind of these toxic financial instruments from non-performing mortgages. Now, based on this picture, people say, you see, I told you the Fed is printing money and it's going to lead to hyperinflation. So before I ask you whether that's been the case, let's first look at what hyperinflation can look like. This is the highest denomination note from the recent hyperinflation in Zimbabwe, $100 trillion. So, what are the main costs of inflation? Maybe not even hyperinflation, which is defined as monthly inflation of 50% or more. But why we dislike inflation? Even inflation, say 5-10%. Why is it bad? What's wrong with it, inflation? You seem like you need some time so let's do another bus time here. I'm going to give you a couple of minutes and just try to, maybe just 1 minute, okay? And try to discuss what are the main costs of higher inflation. Why we don't like that. The main costs of high inflation.
It increases consumption and domestic investment because everything's a lot more expensive.
Right. Okay, but you're kind of assuming that prices are higher, but somehow your income, for example, hasn't changed. But is it the case? In countries where there's higher inflation, what happens to wages? Huh? Right, but again, generally, you can happily imagine a country, and there are many countries who would, or at least in the past, who would have a 10% inflation, annually, but at the same time they would have a proportionate increase in their wages. So I mean, think about scenario 1, where you have inflation. So inflation 10% and wage growth. Wage growth would be, say, 12%. And scenario 2, where you'd have inflation 2% and wage growth 4%. Which one's better? Well, when you kind of work out, there are different ways of working out the real wage, but you could argue that basically inflation eats away 10 percentage points of that. So in both cases, the increase in real wage is by 2 percentage points. So it's not necessarily the case. I agree with you that for many people, if wages don't kind of catch up with the growing prices, that would mean a reduction in the purchasing power of people, by all means. Okay. Any other costs of inflation? Okay.
Well, that depends on whether it's anticipated inflation or unanticipated inflation. Because when it's anticipated, then you have these more simple costs such as reprinting catalogs, or like people exploiting the fact that at the beginning of the year the price will effectively be different than at the end of the year relative to their wages. But if it's unanticipated, that brings, I would say that arguably the costs are bigger because pension schemes, or for example, when you borrow money from a bank, that offsets to estimated inflation. And so if inflation is higher or lower, either the creditor or the debtor will lose money.
Okay, very good point. Okay, so it depends whether you anticipate or you don't anticipate the inflation. If it's 10%, but it's 10% every year, you can anticipate it. It's probably less costly than if it is, say, 6% on average, but it jumps from between 2 and 15. Okay, because this uncertainty introduced by this variable inflation is what makes it very hard for people to plan, for firms to invest, and so on. Okay, so that's a very good distinction. Any other costs?
Long-term planning is less, I guess, because you need to get the value you just earned back right now. You don't save up for the next 5 years to buy a really awesome car because you won't die with that money anyway. So long-term
that's probably true. That encourages uncertainty. Generally encourages more short-term kind of behavior and anything else.
I guess going on a global scale, you can't pay your currency, so the dollar, the pound, the euro, you don't concentrate everything, so your economy would shrink as a result of that.
That's right. Okay, so the value of your currency would generally depreciate. Okay, so there are various costs, and obviously the higher the inflation, the bigger the cost. And the hyperinflation, it generally messes up the economy. By the way, this is from a South African toilet where they were warning people that they can only use toilet paper and they should not be using Zimbabwean dollars. Now, the interesting issue is where the central banks have really started printing money. And it's a bit of a kind of technical argument, but I think you're in the position to understand it. So in economics, there's a distinction between what's called a monetary base, which is basically just currency, plus the reserves that commercial banks keep with the central bank. Okay? And what you saw here was the monetary base. And then what's called a money supply, and there are various money aggregates like M1 and so on, that has the currency plus the deposits that people put into their banks. Okay? Now, what you saw in that picture was basically just an increase in the reserves that banks hold with the Fed. This is not the money that would make its way into the economy. Okay? So the Fed has been kind of lending to these financial institutions, buying all these treasuries and buying all these mortgage-backed securities, but the banks have left the money at the bank, at the central bank. Okay, at the Fed. They didn't take it out into the economy. Why not? Well, first of all, they want to have a big buffer. Okay, they want to have bigger reserves just in case something goes wrong. And secondly, the return prospects in the real economy are now fairly limited. Okay, there are no good investment opportunities. However, so you haven't really seen printing money as such. The printing press running, and the banknotes, the actual banknotes, kind of being thrown in the economy. But once the banks decide to take this money that's theirs, and come with this armored truck, big guys with guns and suitcases, and they take it to the branches so that they give loans to their customers, then it becomes a part of not only a monetary base, it becomes a part of money supply, and then economic theory would predict that would be very inflationary. And how inflationary? Well, if you talk about, say, tripling of the balance sheet here, then if you saw a tripling, 300% increase in money supply, then under various standard circumstances, you should see inflation in the same ballpark. So hundreds of percent, hypothetically. But again, this hasn't happened yet. Now, do you know whether the solution that the Fed has in mind to deal with this, to prevent from this inflationary scenario happening? They have this exit strategy.
Well, they announced now we're going to bring interest rates up again. So expectations are of inflation. So there's like since inflation depends also on expected inflation is low, and that's the strategy.
That's right, but again, this is really about what the banks are doing with their money. Okay, it's like a financial investment type of scenario. So the Fed, what it's trying to do, it was authorized by Congress in late 2008 to actually pay banks interest on this money that the banks leave with the Fed. And the interest that they pay now, I think 25 basis points, is higher than if the bank took the money and lent it to another bank, and obviously safer. So the banks have no incentive to do that. If the economy improved, then obviously they would no longer want to keep money there for 25 basis points, which is 0.25%, and they would want to lend it to their customers. But the Fed can only always change the incentives and raise the interest it's paying so that the banks decide to leave the money with the Fed. And this is their strategy. This is how the Fed wants to prevent all this money making its way in the economy and becoming inflationary by raising that. And slowly they want to suck it out and reduce its balance sheet to a normal level. Will they succeed? It's not obvious. No one really tried that before. And there will certainly be political pressures on the Fed, but okay, let's see. Now, let me show you a bit of the politics here, and I think it's if you want to find out more, there's some interviews I've done about this. Have you guys heard of game theory? Is that game theory? What is it about? Game theory is a really fancy, nice tool that's being used more and more in economics as well as other areas that allows you to model strategic interaction. And strategic interaction means that whatever a decision of one subject is depends on what someone else is doing. Okay, so there's some kind of interrelationship between them. So think about this a game between these two main players: the government, who's in charge of fiscal policy, and the central bank, who's in charge of monetary policy. And to simplify things, each of those players only have two options. So as we talked about the aging population problem and so on, the government has these two options: either to do these unpopular reforms, which will deal with the long-term issues and make fiscal policy sustainable, or it will keep piling up debt and basically just keep going as long as it can until it all goes bust. The central bank has two choices too. First, it may try to maintain price stability no matter what, okay, keeping inflation low at the, say, 2% level. Or it can basically print the money and monetize the debt, the growing debt. Now, obviously, each of those, depending on the choices of these guys, we will have different levels of inflation. If the government does the reforms, then the central bank can easily maintain price stability, and we're going to have this low inflation outcome. However, if the government keeps piling debt, then the central bank will eventually be forced to print the money and create higher inflation. If they fight, and the government piles up debt, whereas the central bank is trying to keep inflation low, we're going to have inflation that's very jumpy and volatile, and as well as the economy. Okay? Now, which of these three possible regimes are we going to get? This is actually a big part of what my research is looking at the kind of a more sophisticated game and trying to identify the different determinants that will cause that we end up in one of these equilibria. And the key thing here, and that's why it's called the game of chicken, is that each of those institutions prefers a different outcome. Okay? If the government, if there was no fiscal gap and everything was okay, then maybe there would be no conflict between the two institutions. But there is. the governments tend to actually prefer this second option, keep piling debt for political reasons and force the central bank to monetize that. At least that's been the case in the past. Whereas the central bank would obviously prefer the government to sort out the mess. If you hear the European Central Bank officials, they always say, you know, the politicians need to clean up and they need to sort out the problems because they created these problems. So the central bank would obviously prefer to be here. Now, let me give you what we try to do in one of my research papers is to look at the probability that countries are in the various equilibria. Now, the closer you're here, and I'm not going to tell you the details of what these things mean, the closer you're here, the lower the probability of high inflation. In other words, this is the corner where the central bank wins the game of chicken. And Australia and New Zealand are the closest, so they have the strongest central bank, and at the same time they have the best setup in terms of fiscal policy. The other part of the spectrum, we have the US and Japan, where the probability of high inflation in the future seems fairly high. European countries are generally in the middle, but I put them in blue because the situation is specific. They do not have, you know, the individual countries cannot create higher inflation. It would have to be at the level of the ECB because they no longer have their own currencies, and that changes things quite a bit. Okay, so it's very hard to say what's going on there, but the bottom line is you want a central bank that's very strong, and one of the ways that you can change things in order for the central bank to become a stronger player and have more kind of power in fighting the government is, for example, when you legislate the inflation target. You might have heard about the regime of inflation targeting, which basically composes of the fact that, I mean, it's got many features, but one of them is that the inflation target is legislated. Say 2%, it's clear, it's transparent, it's for everyone to see. The US does not have a legislated inflation target, which makes it much harder for the Fed to actually fight against the government. But anyway, I want to move on. Let's look at, so are there any questions about higher inflation? Anything you would like to, And about higher inflation, question mark number 2. Anyone would like to add any comments or? Okay, so let's look at question mark number 3. Let's look at the euro. And I'd like to ask you a very simple question, which I'm sure you've thought about, is what are the main advantages or disadvantages of a monetary union? A country throwing up its own currency and becoming a part of a monetary union. Now, if you have time, you can possibly discuss whether the Eurozone is actually an optimal currency area or whether that's not so much the case. But more important are the main advantages and disadvantages of countries tying their currencies together, okay, and adopting a common currency. Okay, so 2 minutes, go for it. So first, the advantages. Why would anyone want to join a currency union? Trade, okay. Exactly, promoting trade, okay. Exactly. Okay, reducing uncertainty about foreign exchange movements. Yep. Exactly. Okay, eliminating the cost of swapping currencies. Yep. Okay, good. Speculation. I can see you've been brainwashed in Germany. No. That's right. Okay. Yeah. Okay. I think that could go under the maybe a reduction of uncertainty, but these are very good points. Absolutely true. Anything else? Okay. Some disadvantages. Yep.
Well, you have no control. The individual countries have no control over their monetary policy anymore.
Okay. So loss of monetary policy. Okay. What else?
I guess like you're tied into the fate of like countries like you see, obviously Greece, like the case for that.
Mm-hmm. So right. So okay, loss of the exchange rate. So some kind of loss of flexibility, and we'll talk about it. Flexibility, because the exchange rate is a mechanism through which a country can kind of somehow. Yep. Okay, so maybe the interconnectedness may lead to kind of domino effects. That's right.
The biggest thing is that you don't have devaluation, so you have different price levels. Basically, production will flow where the price level is lower or where productivity is higher. And normally this would be balanced by a depreciation of the currency of the country with the highest price level, but this doesn't happen if you have, so you don't have this stability mechanism, and this brings imbalances that sooner or later, I mean, either you drive completely a country completely up.
That's right. So, yep. So that's kind of the loss of flexibility when you have different price levels. You can't have the adjustment kind of in nominal terms, so you have it in real terms, which is harder to achieve, and therefore you can have some imbalances. Very good point, which we're going to have. Yep. Okay. Yeah, I would classify it here again. So there are these differences across countries. Which lead to differences in competitiveness and so on. So if I had to summarize this, often it's called, it's referred to as one size fits no one, and we'll talk in a moment about that. So I mean, what is that about? As I talked about the mechanism through which monetary policy works. You know, you're in a downturn, you step on the accelerator, you're in an expansion, the economy is overheating, you step on the brake. Well, imagine if the cycles of the countries are perfectly synchronized. So everyone is at the trough, everyone's at the peak. Then basically they all need the same remedy. They all need either the accelerator, they all need the brake. No problem. However, if the countries have cycles, economic cycles that are not synchronized, then one that is in the downturn might need stepping on the accelerator, whereas the other might need stepping on the brake. And this is precisely what happened before the crisis. Think roughly the period of 2003 to 2006. Germany, France, stagnation. Germany, I think, was in fact in a downturn. Maybe even officially recession, I'm not sure. Spain and Ireland, huge kind of expansion, the economy overheating. Germany needed lower interest rates. Spain and Ireland needed higher interest rates. What did the ECB do? Well, the ECB is looking at the average, so they didn't do much. Okay. In fact, because Germany and France is bigger, the interest rates were actually fairly low. So they were stepping on the accelerator. Okay? What did it lead to in countries at the periphery, like Spain and Ireland? And I'm not talking about Greece because it's a special case. Well, if you're already here, imagine you're already rolling, 200 miles per hour or whatever, and then you still step on the accelerator. You're going to go even faster. So in Spain and Ireland, it created these huge imbalances obviously higher inflation. So think about Spain having, before the crisis, had inflation, say 5%, much higher than in the core. But interest rates were, say, 3. So the real rate was -2. If you have a real rate of -2, what are you going to do? You're going to go and buy the biggest house you can get because you get a really cheap rate, and the banks are all going to give you the money because of various things, implicit government guarantees, and as well as mortgage securitization. So they don't bear the risk. So what I'm saying is that the common currency has very much contributed to these big housing bubbles in the periphery countries like Spain and Ireland, okay? And not only housing bubbles, but related to that is the banking bubble and the asset bubble. The stock markets of those countries, because they seemed like they were going so great, the stock markets were going through the roof, okay? And obviously when the tide changed and all the situation went down the hill, the bubbles burst with very negative consequences. I mean, I think in the stock markets in Ireland, I mean, they lost like 80% of the value within 2 years. So big impact on people's savings. Huge unemployment. Unemployment in Spain went up from like 8% before the crisis to about 25, and among young population, it's like 57 now, or maybe 60, close to 60. So these imbalances and bubbles induced to a large extent by the inappropriateness of euro have very much kind of contributed to the negative consequences that we're seeing now. And the problem is that now, to undo the situation, we need the very opposite, okay? Before they had higher inflation than Germany, so they were basically losing competitiveness. Over the 10 years before the crisis of the euro, they basically lost about 30% of competitiveness against Germany. And now, basically, they need to get it back. But how can you get it back if inflation in the Eurozone must only be 2% on average? That means that we need deflation, falling prices and falling wages in the periphery in Spain and Ireland. And that is very costly. We know from the Japanese example, and we might discuss the costs of deflation if we have time, but these, what's called internal devaluations, forcing Spain, Ireland, and so on to have deflations, have very bad effects on the economy. High unemployment and so on, so they're counterproductive. So to some extent, it's really peculiar because, obviously, German voters are not happy that they have to bail out other countries, but at the same time, they're the ones who very much benefit economically from the situation now. And to a large extent, the reason that German exports are doing so well is not so much that Germany is doing something great. It's just this. It's just the internal changes in the real exchange rate across the countries that have happened before the crisis. Yep. Can you speak up, please? But I mean, they couldn't. This is the thing. Even if the ECB people realized before the crisis this problem with the inappropriateness of the common currencies on a diverging set of countries, they really couldn't do anything. They should have been more clear. I think more vocal about the fact that things are problematic in Spain and Ireland, and that there is a bubble being created, and they should have talked about these problems more. But they just have one instrument, they just have one interest rate, and they don't really have any tools. They would have to. I mean, maybe through banking regulations, through much stricter banking regulation, they could have tried to limit these bubbles at the periphery. But the problem really is the common currency that have led to these very different outcomes. This is the thing, you know. It seems like this mentality where things seem to be doing great, then people just don't want to listen. I mean, you know, there was this optimism. There was actually another theory that, because when you look at what the stock markets and house prices, what they were doing, how they were increasing, people would look at it and say, well, this is not sustainable. This can't go forever. And there was this theory that could justify it. The theory was that because due to the common currency and, you know, being more efficient and so on, these advantages, now we're kind of moving to a higher equilibrium, you know, higher growth equilibrium. So we kind of like need to grow fast here so that we go to the new equilibrium, and then it's gonna, you know. So in that sense, there was a possible justification for, you know, these huge increases in asset prices without, you know, and still saying this is not a bubble, it's just an adjustment to a new equilibrium. But the bottom line is that if countries are not an optimal currency area and their business cycles are not synchronized, then it may be that the common currency actually hurts both the Germany and the Spain. Okay, and now in fact it's the reverse. Now it's the Germany booming and the Spain, but again, because of these imbalances, it might be, you know, it might be hurting them in the longer term.
So now, having the advantage of hindsight, what should they have done if they accepted that in, let's say, 2004? Okay, this is not, we will have 2008. If they had known that, what should they have done?
It's hard. I mean, again, the central bank couldn't do much in terms of monetary policy. It would have to be other instruments, you know, banking regulation, but again, you know, it would have to be to an extent that is, I think, unprecedented. I mean, it would have to be direct, kind of almost interference, direct control, and you know, that would have a lot of undesirable consequences as well. So, you know, I don't think you can heal one wrong with another wrong. I mean, it's not always the case. Well, one thing is clear, that what kind of contributed to these differences, because the idea was, okay, well, Europe, the countries are kind of converging, they're becoming similar, so it shouldn't be a problem, okay? And there was some convergence in the data. What led to the divergence is the fact that many of those countries did not follow the rules, okay? Can someone go and just move the mouse a little bit? Anyway, so for example, the Growth and Stability Pact had these, thank you, the Maastricht criteria. I'm all wired up, you see, I can't walk from here. So if countries followed, like Greece, had to follow the Maastricht criteria in terms of, you know, sticking to, you know, balanced budgets and things like that, then countries wouldn't become so vastly different, okay? That is partly the thing. Then the other thing that could be done is more direct regulation in terms of the banking system, you know, kind of mortgage lending and so on. But again, I'm not normally a fan of regulation. I don't think that these things can be regulated. I mean, you can't go against this big tsunami of the market. I mean, the water's always gonna find its way. So it seems, you know, from with the hindsight, it seems like the lesson we should learn is that these countries are not a common, not an optimal currency area. And one thing that is implied for countries that are not yet in the euro is that they should think very, very carefully about going in. I'm really surprised, based on this experience, that there's still countries who are like so eager to go in the euro now. I mean, you know, again, you're losing not only your independent monetary policy, you're losing the exchange rate flexibility. Look at Iceland. I mean, it almost went bankrupt. But because it had its own common currency that depreciated about 30%, that was a big, you know, boom to their exports and so on, and they recovered fairly quickly. And now contrasted to countries like Ireland and Spain that are going to suffer a very, very long time. So one of the other things that we should do now, and many economists are actually proposing that, is to allow higher inflation in the Eurozone. So if you say allow 4%, if you increase the inflation target to say 4% for 5 years, that means that Spain and Ireland would not have to go into deflation, and it's just going to be enough that they're going to have, the wages are not going to grow, they're going to stay the same level. But because inflation is going to be higher at some other countries, that's going to partly reverse the competitiveness towards Germany and so on. Okay? So if you have 4% over 5 years, that's all going to be 20, 30% that they lost before the crisis. That's a very good question, contrasting Europe to the United States, which is also a currency union. The biggest difference is that the US have a common fiscal policy. Because if we had a United States of Europe with common fiscal policy, then the country that is currently struggling could get transfers from the country that is currently booming, and somehow that could mitigate the differences. The problem that I have with this, and I don't have a problem with fiscal union as such, as long as it is what people want in Europe, but the problem is that could somehow sweep all the problems under the carpet. Okay? Think about Italy. Now everyone complains that the Germans are bailing out the Greeks. In Italy, you don't really have much of that discussion that the North is basically subsidizing the South. So somehow, once you make it within a country or within a fiscal union, these problems are less visible. But they are there. The fact that the south of Italy is so underdeveloped compared to the north is largely because of this common monetary and fiscal union. Okay? So we really have to think hard about whether we want to solve the problems or whether we just want to make them disappear in a way that's not really solving them, but just sweeps them under the rug. So, but this is the biggest problem. The other thing is that the US obviously is much more of a optimal currency area than Europe, historically and so on. So, okay. Now, the other thing that I might just briefly mention is what's called a free riding or moral hazard problem in the EU. Think about being a small country. Think about being Greece before joining the euro. What would happen if the government spends too much? Well, two types of punishment come right that very moment. First, the financial markets punish that country. Higher risk premium, higher borrowing cost. Okay? The exchange rate might also, take a hit. But also the monetary policy in that country might punish the government. The Bank of Greece might go, oh, look, you're spending too much, that creates inflationary pressures. Think about the game of chicken, and the central bank says, oh, no, we don't want higher inflation. We have an inflation target, so we need to raise interest rates. So the central bank will also punish the government, okay, for too much, for excessive spending. Once you join the common currency, all these channels disappear. When you look at the risk premium on Greek debt compared to German debt, shortly it basically shrunk immediately after Greece joining the EU. So financial markets somehow, interpreted as Greece is now implicitly insured by the rest of the union, there's no risk. Okay? At the same time, the Bank of Greece can no longer punish the Greek government for spending too much. Can the ECB do that? No, because again, the ECB is setting interest rates based on everyone. So if the small Greece is doing something, it's not going to do much in terms of inflationary pressures in the union as a whole, and therefore the common central bank doesn't have much kind of power over that little misbehaving country down the corner. Okay? So this is the free riding that this small country, once it joins the EU, all these sticks that are normally there disappear, so it can misbehave. And going back to your question, what should have been done? People should have thought about these incentives, and people should have more carefully designed, for example, make the Maastricht criteria clearly enforceable, okay? So that there's automatic punishment, automatic sanctions, and these kind of things imposed for countries that breach some kind of rules. And there should have been better rules, obviously, okay? But again, it was more a political project from the start rather than an economic project. I remember I was in the late 80s, then Jacques Delors said that, he was hoping soon, I can't remember at what point he said that, but 80% of all the legislation would be done in Brussels. I mean, it was a political ambition. And the economics was kind of somewhere in the background, but it wasn't, when it mattered, it didn't, it didn't make it all the way to the top. Okay, so this is a picture I promised. This is the austerity. Now we're moving on to question number 4. How does this all affect the economic performance in the EU? You see that the countries with the biggest amount of austerity. So austerity here, let me just actually make it. This is a picture from Paul Krugman. So I suppose this is the amount of austerity, and here it's the amount of GDP falling. Okay? And you see that there's a clear negative correlation. So the countries that have the biggest amount of short-term cuts are doing the worst. And this is standard economic theory. I mean, if you're in a downturn, if you start cutting and cutting, it's not going to help. The philosophical or economic foundation for the austerity movement in Europe was based on what Krugman called this confidence fairy. Okay, the fact that all these countries are now going to do something about the fiscal problem is going to bring so much confidence into the market that it's going to more than outweigh the negative effects that economic theory shows it would have. And somehow the confidence fairy did not happen. My conclusion is it didn't happen because we were not doing the right type of austerity. We should have been doing long-term austerity, dealing with the long-term demographic problems and so on. If you start cutting the number of teachers, then that's probably not such a good thing, and it's not going to bring confidence to the market. Okay? So I actually want to look at economic stagnation, the prospect of economic stagnation, into 3 different horizons. So this is the short term. And the short term is not looking very good. Okay? Governments are not reconsidering austerity. Maybe they are. The IMF certainly is reconsidering. The IMF had come out openly and said, look, we were wrong. We thought fiscal multipliers were much lower than they are. So basically the IMF is saying, austerity is damaging. Let's not do that. Okay? But European governments don't seem to think fondly of this idea. So this is the short term. One interesting picture is that I mentioned teachers is that often we may have austerity at the local level. So this is in the US, and this is state and local government employment, and the growth has been about 1% over the last 10 years, and now we see a decline. So it's not just the austerity that we see at the federal levels. It's also at the state and local levels that we have a lot of austerity, which is really killing the economy and also killing long-term growth. Because if you're firing teachers and investing less into infrastructure and technological progress, like research development, it's going to show up somewhere along the horizon. I think I'm going to. Okay, so this was the short term, not looking very good. Over the medium term, I would argue that economic growth is fairly alive and well. One thing that people don't realize is that economic growth is a fairly recent phenomenon, okay, going back to maybe 250 years. Over the previous maybe 2,000 years, there was no economic growth. Thinking in terms of GDP per capita or income per capita, you don't see much at all. There were little bits and pieces where, you know, some people got richer, but overall, this is really a recent phenomenon. There's a lot of literature trying to understand what happened here, the Industrial Revolution that sees this phenomenal growth. But I think we might leave that for another discussion. So once we get out of the mess, hopefully it will happen, and once we sort out these long-term issues, there doesn't seem to be much reason why this growth of, say, 2-3% annually could not continue. But that's the medium-run perspective. I want to spend, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about why this happens, okay? And a lot of research is trying to identify what caused this economic growth. And there's a clear answer to that question. The main sustainable driver of economic progress has been the accumulation of human capital that leads to technological progress, okay? Basically, people get, through education, people get smarter, they have better ideas, they come up with innovation, they convert them into, you know, better technologies, which leads to growth of labor productivity. So you may have the same amount of people, same amount of natural resources, but as long as you do things smarter, you produce more, okay? Or you produce the same with less amount of time. Now, some of you might disagree, and some of you might say that, in fact, it was all because we've abused the environment. We were using more resources and so on. And I'll address it on the next slide. But do you guys think that there's a fixed technological limit? You know, there's a limit to our genius, our ability to come up with new ideas? You know, have we come up with all the, there's a funny quote. Apparently, he didn't say that, but it's often quoted that the head of the US Patent Office, more than 100 years ago, he said, everything that can be invented has already been invented. I think few people would argue that. You know, with the speed of innovation, there doesn't seem to be a fixed limit where we kind of run out of ideas. So again, this is why I said that from a medium-term perspective, economic growth is alive and well. There doesn't seem to be much limit. So let me move to the, I mentioned GDP discussion, and there's a beautiful quote by Bob Kennedy about GDP. Let me give you a bit of time to just read this, the quote. It's really one of the most beautiful quotes by a politician. That's his criticism of GDP. So he basically argues that GDP includes all the wrong things and none of the good things. It doesn't include the beauty of our poetry and the strength of our marriages. I mean, wait, how come we don't have politicians like that anymore? But anyway, the bottom line is that even though you have to acknowledge that he's right on most of these accounts, there's some good news. The good news is that even if you just use the official GDP statistics with all its flaws, it seems that it highly correlates with what we actually want to measure, which is the life satisfaction of people. So if you want to find out more, there's a summary of this late research by Justin Wolfers and co-authors. It basically shows you a lot of countries. And on the horizontal axis, you have GDP per capita. And on the vertical axis, you have, on a scale from 1 to 10, some kind of life satisfaction. That is from various surveys. And what you see is that the richer countries tend to have people that are more satisfied. Obviously, this is not a perfect correlation, but it's quite a strong one. And it's not only across countries, it's also within countries. So when you the distribution within countries is given by this line. So for example, here down the bottom, Bulgaria, a bit of a grumpy country where people are not very happy. They are below this line, the trend line. But still, the happy people in that country, the richer people in Bulgaria are happier than the poor people. So whenever you have the little line for each country with a positive slope, it means that there's also this correlation. Whenever it's flat, it means like Afghanistan, it doesn't matter whether you're rich or poor. But now you can replace the vertical axis, life satisfaction, you could replace it with other statistics, other indicators. If you look at, there are surveys that ask people, how many times have you smiled today? Okay? So even if you put this across, correlated with GDP, you're going to see a similar relationship. Okay? So yes, let's be critical of the GDP and try to think of better alternatives, and there are many, but still, it does tell us something about people's happiness and prosperity and so on. So I just wanted to mention that because the big critics of GDP often try to ignore this point. Okay, now what about the nature? And let me move into a long-term perspective. And you might be surprised that you're going to hear it from the economists, but I want to talk about the environment a little bit. Are there any environmental limits to economic growth? Many people argue that yes, we've abused the environment, and I try to convince you is that that's not a necessary condition, that we can have growth without abusing the environment. But there are some limits, and there's a lot of talk about global warming. So you obviously know how it works. We consume energy here on Earth, and then it needs to radiate into space. And if the atmosphere has a lot of greenhouse gases, it's like a bit of a lid. So all this energy can't go, and it warms the planet. And I'm sure you've heard in the media about this global warming research. It's all disputed. Some people say global warming exists, some don't. So let me just give you a show of hands. Who thinks global warming is real, it's a danger, and it's caused by human activity? Hands up. Okay, so virtually everyone. And you're right. There's a recent meta-study by James Powell who looked at about 4,000 articles published on global warming in scientific journals over the last 20 years, and only 24 of them reject global warming, human-caused global warming, or endorse other than CO2 emissions for observed warming. So there's a huge consensus in the scientific community, okay, that this is something that we're responsible for. The big thing is that all the models predict that we might see, current global temperature on Earth is about 14 degrees Celsius. Now, the predictions until 2100 is that the increase might be 2 to 5 degrees. Okay. In fact, the Stern report says that even something like 6 degrees is a real possibility. Now, think 14. And, in the past, we've had changes over, centuries and centuries in the order of point something of a degree Celsius. And now, within less than a century, you're going to have 2 to 5. I mean, you know, it's the cost. And the Stern report argues that the costs would be unprecedented. It'd be like at least 5% of GDP, just the economic cost, but if you take into account all the related costs, maybe even 20% of GDP. It would just totally change the way we do things, both in terms of farming, in terms of economics, and so on. But what some people don't realize, and I've been reading a lot of the physics literature, is that even if we do eliminate, if we do stabilize greenhouse gases, so we kind of take out the lid, there would still be global warming if we keep using, if the growth in energy consumption is as high as it has been. If you look at the last 100 years, global energy consumption has been increasing on average about 3% per year. Now, if you extrapolate this, then at this speed, within about 300 to 400 years, depending on your assumptions, just purely from the laws of thermodynamics, okay, you consume energy here, it has to radiate. Even without the lid of greenhouse gases, within 300 to 400 years, the temperature on Earth would reach a boiling point, 100 degrees. Okay. Now, I'm not saying that this will happen. What I'm saying is that we simply cannot keep consuming more and more energy as we have in the past. So, from a very longer term perspective, the growth that we're going to see in the future must be a slightly different or very different type of growth that we have seen. If you want to find out more about this, I encourage you to read a blog by a physicist, Tom Murphy, who has a lot of interesting stuff on this in a way that even non-physicists can understand. But so I recently wrote this piece in Hospodářské noviny. This is the Czech financial paper, which kind of had a lot of comments, and I can't quote them here because it's still not 10 o'clock in the evening. You know, they were not really nice. But one of the things I did, I tried to put some ideas of how we can actually all contribute to using less energy and making the future more environmentally sustainable. And just some of the things that kind of may strike you. For example, laptops use 90% less energy than desktops. I mean, such a simple thing, but most people don't know that. One of the striking things is using kettles, you know, to boil water. There's a lot of research that shows that, for example, in the UK, more than 30% of the energy used with kettles is wasted just by overfilling the kettle. You just put more water than you need. You don't think about it, right? It's just energy. From a global perspective, that 30% would be enough to cover half of the UK's public lighting. So we're talking a lot of energy. So, I mean, my plea to people is that once we start thinking a little bit about how we use energy, we can all contribute to a more sustainable future. So I'm not saying we should go back to the candlelight or back to the trees. In fact, there's a lot of research that shows the costs of limiting, and by the way, this thermodynamic channel, the second channel that I talked about, this is not going to show up for at least 200 years, okay? So the standard greenhouse gases story is the present danger, okay? That's the thing that we need to deal with. But again, I wanted to talk about the second story because people don't know it. Anyway, the Stern report put it at about 1% of GDP that would be the cost of limiting greenhouse gases. That's nothing. You know, some people have this idea that because energy is used in everything, we would basically have to give up our lifestyle in order to deal with global warming. That's wrong. Okay? It would be the cost would be fairly modest relative to the cost of doing nothing, which would be very painful. Okay. Now, so we have 10 more minutes. So what I want to do, I want to kind of bring all the things together. I promised you an analogy that links all these 4 big question marks. So let's, if there's one thing that you remember when I walk out, hopefully that will be this. Okay? So here's the analogy. Think about an overweight person who develops diabetes because of his weight. And then the doctor obviously suggests that the person needs to, in order not to die, the person needs to change lifestyles, meaning, eating habits, improving eating habits, and eating better. And adding exercise. And the patient, and we're all very good at listening to the doctors, the patient instead ties his hands for a day, once a week, not to be able to go to the fridge and take the food. Okay? Now, obviously, he's surprised, but it doesn't work. It didn't help with his condition. So what does he do? He decides to have his legs permanently tied. So not only the hands once a week, but legs permanently. And obviously, this does not help either, but as a consequence of all this, he develops vitamin deficiency because of this poor diet, and because of the associated stress, he also develops high blood pressure. So let me relate it to our 4 question marks and introduce the cast and characters. So what's the overweight stand for? Well, the weight of the patient, the excessive weight, is basically the long-term trend in government spending that we've seen, and that is predicted to continue. And that's not only due to the pension and healthcare areas, but also social welfare that's been increasing due to various political factors. Oops, this is check. Diabetes is a symbol for the unsustainable setting of public finances. Okay? So again, because we have too much spending, it leads to unsustainable setting. And obviously, when you have diabetes, your body is missing insulin. Here, the government budget is missing the revenues. So this is the analogy there. What else? Well, premature death that the doctor is basically warning the patient against, that's the government default, okay? That's the bankruptcy that we all know would have a dire consequences on the well-being of the individuals, if the patient dies, family is not happy. What about the prescribed treatment? The doctor says, well, you need to do exercise, you need to improve your diet. Well, here, the prescribed treatment is the conceptual reforms that I talked about. Pensions, health systems, social systems that we need to reform in order to account for the aging generations, aging population problem. What about the fridge that the patient goes to? Well, it's the current young and all future generations, because the patient's really taking all the food, there'll be no food left. So the younger generations will have to deal with this through higher taxations. What about tied hands? Well, the analogy of tied hands is really the arbitrary spending cuts that we've seen. That's the European austerity. Okay? So you don't do the right thing, but you just cut here and there. It's like one day a week, you tie your hands, you can't go there, but because it's not a proper solution, it doesn't have the required effect. Okay? And as I mentioned, because of that, it undermines the chances of the recovery, and it kind of halts economic growth. Tied legs, that's the euro. Okay? I mentioned permanently, well, your tied legs kind of reduce the flexibility. We talked about giving up monetary policy, which is one flexibility channel. We talked about loss of foreign exchange, which is another flexibility channel. So that is kind of personified in the tied legs analogy. Accession to a common currency. Vitamin deficiency that are a consequence of this That's the undesirable internal devaluation. That's the deflation in Spain and Ireland that you need to have, and that is imposed by the common currency. We're running to an end, and high blood pressure, that's the higher inflation that you need to have if you don't deal with the problem of unsustainable fiscal policy. So that's the debt monetization that you need to have. So putting it all together, unhealthy lifestyle, you're overweight, that leads to diabetes and premature death risks, that leads to higher blood pressure probability, and avitaminosis, which is also due to the tight legs and hands. And all this leads to poor health outcomes, which again increases your risk of premature death, which is exactly the opposite of what you wanted. Remember, before we had aging populations here, unsustainable fiscal policy, higher inflation here, that leads to low economic growth, together with the tight legs and hands, which is the austerity measures and euro accession. Okay, so let me just recap here of what I suppose we should do. I think we should really put pressure on our politicians to stop being short-sighted, and we should focus on solving the long-term problems. In other words, in terms of our patient, we should propose a suitable diet that will solve, the overweight problem once and for all, not just temporarily. And it might be uncomfortable a little bit, when you have to give up some things that you used to, but it will certainly be beneficial in the longer term, both in terms of stimulating economic activity and averting the danger of a sovereign bankruptcy. Okay, and that should benefit our wallets as well as our refrigerators. So, normally I wanted to recap things and give you a bit of time. So, but let me just recap my view. Are we going to see bankruptcy of public finances in European countries? I believe almost certainly yes, unless we change the way we do them. Are we going to see hyperinflation? Well, almost certainly not. Hyperinflation is very unlikely, but higher inflation in the range of, say, 3 to 10%, I think is quite likely in the medium to longer term, precisely if fiscal policy keeps on the unsustainable track. Collapse of the euro, very unlikely in terms of disappearance of the euro from the earth, from the surface of the earth, but I think the likelihood that it will break up, some countries will have to leave, countries like Greece and others, I think is really growing when we delay the conceptual solution. So again, it is linked to public finances as well as to the problem with the common currency. Are we going to see persistent stagnation? In the short term, probably. Long term, medium term, not necessarily. Long term, well, it will have to be a very different type of growth from what we see. It will have to be an energy stable type of growth because of the physical limits. If you are interested in some of the interviews, you find them on my YouTube channel. There are different, Reserve Bank of Australia. This is a board member, and this one too. This is a parliament member in Australia. Anyway, I just always invite people, and in front of my students, we chat about things. So a lot of those things are related to the topics we talked about today. Anyway, we're out of time. Thanks very much for your patience and your involvement and very enthusiastic responses. So thanks again, and hopefully we might spend a few more minutes if you have any more questions. So thanks for that. Thanks.